October 2nd, 1918. The Argonne Forest, France. In a ravine so deep that sunlight barely touches the forest floor, 554 American soldiers are about to be swallowed by the earth itself. They don't know it yet, but in less than 48 hours they will be surrounded, cut off, forgotten, and the men who sent them there will have no idea how to bring them back. This is the story of the Lost Battalion, a story of men trapped between two armies, a story of friendly fire, starvation and betrayal, a story of a commander who refused to surrender and a pigeon who saved them all. But most of all, this is a story about what happens when war forgets you're still alive. So let's go back. Back to the autumn of 1918. The Great War has been bleeding Europe dry for 4 years. Millions are dead, empires are crumbling, and the world is exhausted. But there's a new force on the Western Front now. America, fresh-faced, eager, and completely unprepared for what's waiting in the forests of France. The American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John J. Pershing, have been in Europe for over a year. But they're still green, still learning, still dying in numbers that shock even the hardened British and French veterans. And now, in September 1918, Pershing is planning the largest American offensive in history, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The objective is simple on paper. Push through the heavily fortified German lines, break through the Argonne Forest, cut the German supply lines, end the war. 1 million American soldiers, 26,000 tons of ammunition, 4,000 artillery pieces. It should be a steamroller, but the Germans have been waiting here for 4 years. They've turned the Argonne into a nightmare zone. Every tree conceals barbed wire and machine gun nests, and the forest itself, the forest is something out of a fever dream. Ancient, dense, dark, the kind of place where men disappear. On September 26, 1918, the offensive begins. American boys, many who'd never left their home states before, climb out of their trenches and walk into hell. The casualties are immediate, staggering. Within hours, the advance is already falling apart. Units lose contact with each other in the thick forest. Artillery maps are useless. The trees are so dense that forward observers can't see anything. Communication lines are cut by German bombardment almost as fast as they're laid. Chaos. But the orders keep coming from headquarters, miles behind the lines, where generals study maps in warm tents and move pins across paper. Advance, push forward, don't stop. Among those advancing units is the 77th Infantry Division, the Liberty Division. They're mostly New Yorkers, immigrants and sons of immigrants, Italians, Irish, Jews, Poles, the kind of men who knew the streets of Manhattan better than the forests of France. They're tough, street-smart, loyal to each other, but they're not soldiers, not really, not yet. Leading one battalion of these men is Major Charles White Whittlesey, and this is where our story really begins. Charles Whittlesey was not a soldier, not by nature anyway. He was a lawyer, a Harvard-educated attorney from a small town in Wisconsin, tall, thin, bespectacled. He looked more like a professor than a warrior. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who chose his words carefully and rarely raised his voice. His men called him Galloping Charlie, but not because he was fast. It was ironic, because Whittlesey never rushed anything. He was methodical, careful, some said cautious, but there was something else about him. Something harder to see but impossible to miss once you knew him. Charles Whittlesey did not bend. When he gave his word, it was iron. When he received an order, he followed it, no matter the cost. When he made a decision, he lived with it, even if it destroyed him. He was the kind of man the army builds monuments to after they've used him up. By October 1st, 1918, Whittlesey's battalion had been fighting in the Argonne for 5 days. They were exhausted. They'd pushed forward through machine gun fire, through artillery barrages, through muddy shell craters that could swallow a man whole. They'd taken casualties, lost contact with neighboring units, watched friends die in the undergrowth, but they'd held their positions. And now, division headquarters had new orders. Continue the advance, push deeper into the forest, take the high ground near the Charlevoix ravine. Whittlesey studied his maps. He looked at the terrain, at the intelligence reports, at the gaps in the line where friendly units were supposed to be but weren't. He knew this was dangerous. His flanks would be exposed. His supply lines would be stretched impossibly thin. His men were already low on ammunition, food and water, but the orders were clear, and Charles Whittlesey did not disobey orders. He called his officers together. Captain George McMurtry, a former Wall Street banker and one of the toughest men in the division, Captain Nelson Holderman, Lieutenant Wilhelm, and the others. They could see it in Whittlesey's eyes. This was a bad idea. But they were soldiers now, and soldiers followed orders. On the morning of October 2nd, 1918, Major Charles Whittlesey led 554 men deeper into the Argonne Forest. They moved through the trees like ghosts, silent, alert. The forest was eerily quiet, too quiet. By mid-afternoon, they'd reached their objective, a steep ravine near Charlevoix Mill, deep in German-held territory. Whittlesey ordered his men to dig in. They established a defensive perimeter, set up machine gun positions, posted sentries, and then they waited. They waited for the units on their flanks to catch up, for reinforcements, for supplies. They waited for the American line to extend forward and link up with them, but night fell and nobody came. What Whittlesey didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the rest of the American advance had stalled. The units that were supposed to be on his left and right flanks had been stopped cold by German defenses. They'd taken heavy casualties and fallen back. And now Whittlesey's battalion was alone, a finger pointing into enemy territory, surrounded on three sides, and the Germans knew exactly where they were. October 3rd, 1918, dawn. The attack came without warning. German infantry hidden in the forest opened fire from all directions, machine guns, mortars, rifle grenades. The Americans scrambled for cover, diving behind trees, into shell craters, behind fallen logs. But there was nowhere to hide. The Germans had the high ground, they had clear fields of fire, and they had numbers. Whittlesey quickly realized the truth. They weren't just under attack, they were surrounded. He gathered his officers in a small dugout, studied the situation. German forces to the north, south, east, and west. The only direction not completely blocked was back the way they'd come, but that route was heavily contested. They could try to retreat, but Whittlesey's orders had been clear. Hold the position. Don't fall back. And besides, retreat under fire through dense forest with wounded men, it would be a massacre. So he made the decision that would define everything that followed. They would stay, they would hold, and they would wait for relief. Captain McMurtry agreed. So did the other officers. They had no choice, really, so they dug in deeper, reinforced their positions, rationed their ammunition, and they sent out runners. Young soldiers, barely 20 years old, were given a desperate mission. Break through the German lines, get back to American headquarters, tell them what's happening, tell them to send help. Most of those runners never made it. They were shot in the forest, captured, lost in the maze of trenches and barbed wire, but a few got through. And by the afternoon of October 3rd, American headquarters finally understood the situation. Whittlesey's battalion was trapped, completely surrounded by German forces, over 500 men cut off in enemy territory. Back at division headquarters there was panic. Generals huddled around maps, argued, pointed fingers. Some wanted to send immediate reinforcements, break through to Whittlesey. Others said it was too risky. The Germans were too entrenched. Any rescue attempt would just mean more casualties. And some quietly suggested that Whittlesey had disobeyed orders by advancing too far. That this was his fault. But whether it was Whittlesey's fault or not, 500 men were trapped in that forest, and they were running out of time. October 4th, 1918. The rain came, cold, relentless. It turned the ravine into a swamp. The dugouts filled with water. The men had no shelter, no dry clothes, no way to get warm. They shivered in the mud, huddled together for warmth, their uniforms soaked through, and they were hungry. The battalion had brought rations for 2 days, but this was day 3, and there was no way to resupply. The men shared what little food they had left, a handful of hardtack, a piece of chocolate, a sip of water from the muddy stream that ran through the ravine. Some ate leaves, others chewed on bark, and still the Germans attacked. The German forces surrounding the ravine didn't launch full-scale assaults. They didn't need to. They had the Americans trapped, so they simply waited. Snipers picked off any American who moved. Machine gunners swept the ravine every few hours. Mortars dropped shells into the crowded positions, killing and wounding men who had no way to escape. The Germans called down to the Americans in English, "Surrender! You're surrounded! Your army has abandoned you! Why die for nothing?" Some of the younger soldiers looked to their officers, looked to Whittlesey. Maybe the Germans were right, maybe headquarters didn't know they were here, maybe they'd been forgotten. But Whittlesey stood firm. He walked among his men, calm and steady despite the chaos. He visited the wounded in the makeshift aid station, where Captain Holderman and the medics were performing surgery with no anesthesia, no proper tools. He told his men the same thing over and over: "Help is coming, hold on, don't give up." But privately, Whittlesey was beginning to doubt. 3 days, no reinforcements, no supplies. How long could they hold? The wounded were the worst part. There were over 100 now. Men with shattered limbs, gut wounds, head injuries. They lay in the mud, crying for water, for morphine, for their mothers. The medics did what they could. But without proper medical supplies, men were dying from wounds that should have been survivable, and there was nowhere to bury them. The dead piled up at the edge of the perimeter, friends, brothers, bodies that just days ago had been laughing, smoking, talking about what they'd do when the war was over. By October 5th, day 4, the situation was critical. No food, almost no water, ammunition running dangerously low, and still, headquarters sent no relief. But they did send something that would make everything worse. October 5th, 1918, mid-morning. The men in the ravine heard it first, the unmistakable sound of incoming artillery. But something was wrong. The shells weren't landing on German positions, they were landing on them. American artillery, miles behind the lines, had been ordered to bombard the area around the Lost Battalion. The coordinates were supposed to target German positions, but someone made a mistake. The shells fell directly into Whittlesey's ravine. Trees exploded into splinters. The ground erupted. Men were thrown through the air, torn apart by shrapnel from their own army's guns. The wounded, lying helpless in the aid station, were killed instantly. Others were buried alive as the earthen walls of the ravine collapsed. Whittlesey screamed for his men to take cover, but there was no cover, not from this. The barrage lasted 20 minutes, 20 minutes of hell. When it finally stopped, the ravine was unrecognizable. Craters, bodies, smoke. And the survivors, those still alive, looked at each other with the same horrified realization. Their own army was killing them. Whittlesey knew he had to stop it, had to get a message back to headquarters. But how? Runners had failed. Radio had been destroyed days ago. Carrier pigeons were the only option left. The battalion had brought a small basket of homing pigeons, birds trained to fly back to American lines carrying messages. Most were already dead, killed by shell fire or released in previous, failed attempts. Only 2 birds remained. Whittlesey called for his signal officer, Lieutenant Tollefson. "We need to send a message, now, before they shell us again." Tollefson nodded, carefully retrieved one of the 2 remaining pigeons. Whittlesey wrote the message himself, his hand shaking not from fear but from exhaustion and rage. The message was short, desperate, precise. "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." He rolled the message into a small capsule, attached it to the pigeon's leg, and released the bird. For a moment they watched it climb above the trees, circling, trying to find direction. And then a German sniper shot it out of the sky. The men watched the bird fall, watched their hope fall with it. Whittlesey closed his eyes. 1 pigeon left. 1 chance. The last bird was small, a blue-checkered hen with 1 blind eye. Her name was Cher Ami, dear friend. Cher Ami was not an impressive bird. She was small, even for a pigeon. One of her eyes had been damaged in a previous mission, leaving her partially blind. She'd been donated to the US Army Signal Corps by British pigeon breeders in 1918. Just one of 600 birds used for communication on the Western Front. She'd flown missions before, carried messages through artillery fire, through smoke, through chaos. But she'd never faced anything like this. Lieutenant Tollefson held her gently. Whittlesey wrote a new message, this one even more desperate than the first. "We are along the road, parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." He added their exact coordinates, underlined them twice. This was their last chance. If this bird didn't make it, the shelling would continue, and the battalion would be wiped out by its own army. Tollefson attached the message to Cher Ami's leg, whispered something to her, a prayer maybe, and then he opened his hands. Cher Ami launched into the air. She circled once, twice. The men held their breath. The Germans saw her immediately. Bullets tore through the air around her. Machine guns opened up, trying to bring her down. For a moment she faltered, dropped. The men watching thought she'd been hit, but then she caught herself, climbed higher, and she flew. She flew through a storm of gunfire, through smoke and shrapnel, higher, faster. The Germans kept shooting, desperate to bring her down. And then, just as she cleared the tree line, she was hit. But Cher Ami didn't fall. She kept flying. 25 miles, through the chaos of the battlefield, through artillery barrages and smoke, blood trailing from her wounds, one leg hanging by a tendon, her breast pierced by shrapnel. But she flew. She flew for 25 minutes. 25 minutes of pure determination. Until finally she saw it. The American loft, home. She landed just outside the Pigeon loft at division headquarters. Collapsed. A soldier on duty saw her, ran over. He carefully removed the message capsule from her mangled leg, and he ran it directly to the commanding officer. Within minutes, orders went out to every artillery battery. Cease fire immediately on coordinates 276.4. The shelling stopped. The Lost Battalion was saved, not by tanks, not by infantry, not by generals, by a Pigeon. Cher Ami survived. Army medics operated on her immediately. They couldn't save her leg, it had to be amputated. They carved her a small wooden prosthetic. She recovered, became a hero. After the war, she was awarded the French Croix de Guerre for her bravery. When she died in 1919, her body was preserved and placed in the Smithsonian Institution, where it remains today. A small bird, with one eye, one leg, who saved nearly 200 men. October 6, 1918. The shelling had stopped, but the men of the Lost Battalion were still trapped, still surrounded, still starving. By now they'd been cut off for 5 days. No food, no water except what they could scoop from the contaminated stream. No medical supplies. Over half the battalion was dead or wounded. The survivors were skeletal, hollow-eyed, barely able to stand. Some had stopped talking, just sat in the mud staring at nothing. Others prayed, wrote letters they knew would never be sent. Captain McMurtry, wounded himself now, moved among the men with Whittlesey. They tried to keep spirits up, told jokes, shared memories of home. But it was getting harder. The Germans, sensing the Americans were near breaking, sent another delegation. A German officer under a white flag approached the American lines. He carried a letter. To the commanding officer of the American forces, "You are surrounded. Your situation is hopeless. Your men are dying needlessly. We offer you the honorable terms of surrender. If you refuse, we will be forced to destroy you completely. You have 1 hour to decide." The letter was brought to Whittlesey. He read it once, twice. His officers waited. Some of the men were listening, watching their commander's face. What would he do? Whittlesey looked at the German messenger, looked at his own men, wounded, starving, dying. And then he did something that would become legend. He tore the letter in half, and he sent the messenger back without a reply. No surrender, not now, not ever. The Germans didn't understand it. The Americans were beaten, surrounded, out of food, water, ammunition. Why wouldn't they surrender? But they didn't understand Charles Whittlesey, and they didn't understand these New York boys who'd followed him into hell. When word spread through the ravine that Whittlesey had refused to surrender, something changed. The men, broken as they were, found something inside themselves. Pride, stubbornness, anger. They weren't going to die quietly. If the Germans wanted them, they'd have to come take them. And the Germans tried. October 7th, another assault. German infantry, supported by flamethrowers and grenades, pushed into the ravine. The Americans, with almost no ammunition left, fought back with bayonets, with rocks, with their bare hands, hand-to-hand fighting in the mud, men grappling in shell craters, stabbing, choking, dying. The Germans were pushed back, barely. The cost was horrific, but the Lost Battalion held, And then, on the evening of October 7th, they heard it. American voices shouting, shooting, getting closer. After 5 days, American forces finally broke through. The 77th Division, reinforced and reorganized, launched a massive assault on the German positions surrounding Whittlesey's battalion. They fought through machine gun nests, through trenches, through the same hell that had trapped the Lost Battalion in the first place. And slowly, meter by meter, they pushed the Germans back. Inside the ravine, the survivors heard the fighting getting closer. Some were too weak to stand, too exhausted to care. But others, those who still had strength left, grabbed their rifles, fixed their bayonets. If this was a German trick, they'd die fighting. But then they heard clear American voices calling out, "77th, where are you? Whittlesey, Major Whittlesey." American soldiers pushing through the forest calling out, looking for them. The men of the Lost Battalion started shouting back, waving, crying, and then they saw them. American uniforms, fresh faces, men carrying food, water, medical supplies. The relief column stopped at the edge of the ravine. What they saw made them freeze. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were ghosts, skeletons in uniforms, covered in mud and blood. Some couldn't walk. Others couldn't speak. The dead lay everywhere. And in the center of it all stood Major Charles Whittlesey. Tall, thin, his glasses cracked, his uniform torn, but standing. The relief commander, a colonel, walked up to Whittlesey, saluted. "Sir, we're here. You're safe now." Whittlesey nodded, tried to speak. Couldn't. He just nodded. And then, quietly, he turned and walked back to his men. Of the 554 men who entered the Argonne Forest on October 2nd, 194 walked out. The rest were dead or wounded. The survivors were evacuated immediately, carried on stretchers, loaded into ambulances. Most had to be hospitalized for weeks, some for months. They suffered from malnutrition, exposure, infections, wounds that wouldn't heal. And nightmares back at division headquarters. There were questions, investigations. Who gave the order to advance so far without support? Why weren't reinforcements sent immediately? Why did it take 5 days to mount a rescue? And the biggest question, was Major Whittlesey a hero, or was he reckless? The army didn't know what to do with Charles Whittlesey. On one hand, he'd held an impossible position against overwhelming odds. He'd refused to surrender. He'd saved what was left of his battalion. On the other hand, over 300 men were dead. Some officers blamed him, said he'd advanced too aggressively, that he should have retreated when he had the chance. Others defended him, said he was following orders, that he did everything right in an impossible situation. The decision was made at the highest levels. Charles Whittlesey would be a hero. The Lost Battalion would become a symbol of American determination and courage. The uncomfortable questions would be quietly buried. Whittlesey was awarded the Medal of Honor. He became famous, a national hero. Parades were held in his honor. Newspapers wrote glowing articles. He was invited to speak at rallies, to sell war bonds, to shake hands with politicians. America loved him, but Charles Whittlesey didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted to forget. The war ended 5 weeks later. November 11th, 1918, the armistice. The guns fell silent across Europe. Millions of men went home. But not Charles Whittlesey. Not really. He returned to New York, tried to resume his law practice. But he couldn't escape what had happened in the Argonne. The press wouldn't leave him alone. They wanted interviews, photographs, speeches. Tell us about the heroism, the courage, the glory. But Whittlesey didn't see glory. He saw the faces of the men who died, heard their screams, smelled the mud and blood and death. He started drinking, stopped sleeping. Friends noticed he was withdrawing, becoming quieter, more distant. He attended reunions with his surviving men, but he couldn't look them in the eye. Every time he saw them, he saw the ones who weren't there, the ghosts. In November 1921, 3 years after the armistice, Charles Whittlesey boarded an ocean liner. The SS Toloa, bound for Havana. He told friends he needed a vacation, time to think. On the night of November 26, 1921, Whittlesey was seen on deck, alone, staring at the ocean. The next morning, he was gone. His cabin was empty. His life preserver was folded neatly on his bed. Next to it was a letter, The contents of that letter were never made public. Charles White Whittlesey, Medal of Honor recipient, hero of the Lost Battalion, had walked into the ocean and disappeared. He was 42 years old. Some said it was the guilt. Others said it was the nightmares. Maybe it was both. Or maybe Charles Whittlesey never really left that ravine in the Argonne. Maybe part of him stayed there, with his men, in the mud, in the darkness, and he was just trying to find his way back. Today you can visit the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. In the National Museum of American History, there's a small display. Behind glass, mounted carefully, is a taxidermied pigeon. Small, blue checkered feathers, one eye missing. One leg replaced with a carved wooden prosthetic, Cher Ami. Next to her there's a faded piece of paper, the original message she carried. We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. Written in desperate handwriting, stained with mud and blood, thousands of people walk past that display every year. Most stop, read the placard, take a photo, and then they move on. But some stand there longer. They look at that small, broken bird, and they understand what she represents. Not just courage, not just heroism, but something deeper. She represents the idea that in war, in the absolute worst moments of human suffering, sometimes the smallest, most fragile things can make the difference between life and death. That hope can come on broken wings, that salvation can arrive in the most unexpected forms, and that even when armies fail, when generals make mistakes, when men are abandoned and forgotten, sometimes something survives. Someone makes it through. Someone carries the message home. If you go to France today, to the Argonne Forest, you can still find it, the ravine where the Lost Battalion made their stand. It's quiet now, peaceful. Trees have grown over the shell craters, grass covers the trenches. Nature has reclaimed what war once destroyed. But if you look carefully, you can still see traces. Rusted barbed wire, half buried in the earth. Fragments of shells, pieces of equipment. And sometimes if you dig just a little, you find things that shouldn't be there. Buttons, buckles, dog tags, pieces of men who never went home. There's a memorial there now, a simple stone marker placed by the American Battle Monuments Commission. It reads, "Here stood the Lost Battalion, October 27, 1918. They held." Every year, a few people make the pilgrimage. Historians, descendants of the men who fought there, veterans of other wars who understand what happened in this place. They stand at that marker and they try to imagine it. Try to imagine what those 5 days were like. The hunger, the fear, the cold, the sound of their own artillery falling on them, the desperate hope that someone somewhere was coming to save them. But you can't really imagine it. Not unless you've been there. Not unless you've felt the kind of abandonment those men felt. The kind of terror. The kind of determination. What you can do is remember their names, remember their sacrifice, remember that they didn't ask to be heroes. They didn't want glory or medals or parades. They just wanted to survive, to go home, to see their families again. 360 of them never did. Let's talk about some of them. The men who were there, the ones who have names, stories, who were more than just statistics. Private Abraham Krotoszyński, 23 years old, born in Poland, grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He was one of the runners, volunteered to break through German lines on the second night, made it, delivered the message that told headquarters the battalion was surrounded, earned the Distinguished Service Cross, survived the war, lived to be 71. Private Lowell R. Hollingshead, 20 years old, from Ohio, killed on October 4th by German machine gun fire while trying to get water from the stream. His body lay in the ravine for 3 days before anyone could reach it. His mother received a letter 4 months later telling her he died a hero. She kept that letter for the rest of her life. Captain George McMurtry, 41 years old, Wall Street banker before the war, wounded on October 5th, refused evacuation, stayed with his men. When Whittlesey was overwhelmed by the chaos, McMurtry kept the battalion organized, kept men alive through sheer force of will. He also received the Medal of Honor. Unlike Whittlesey, he lived a long life. Died in 1958, age 81. At his funeral, Survivors of the Lost Battalion carried his coffin, Private Cher Ami's handler, whose name is lost to history. The man who cared for the pigeons, who fed them, trained them, kept them alive, who held Cher Ami one last time before releasing her into that storm of bullets. We don't know his name. He's not in any of the official histories, but without him, there would be no message, no rescue, no survivors. These were the men of the Lost Battalion, immigrants and farm boys, lawyers and laborers, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, black soldiers and white soldiers, fighting side by side. The America that existed before the cynicism, before the disillusionment. Young men who believed, truly believed, that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. And maybe they were. Or maybe they were just fighting for each other, for the man next to them in the mud, for the friend who shared his last piece of hardtack, for the officer who refused to leave them behind. After the war, the U.S. Army conducted an official inquiry. They wanted to understand what had happened, what went wrong. Why were over 500 men surrounded and cut off for 5 days? The findings were complicated. The orders Whittlesey received on October 1st were clear: advance. But those orders were based on faulty intelligence. Division headquarters believed the German defenses were weaker than they actually were. They believed neighboring units would keep pace with Whittlesey's advance. They were wrong on both counts. When Whittlesey's battalion became surrounded, headquarters panicked. They knew a rescue attempt would be costly. They weren't sure it would succeed. So they hesitated. For 2 days, they hesitated. Meanwhile, men were dying in that ravine. The inquiry found no single person at fault. It was a failure of communication, of intelligence, of coordination. In other words, it was war. People make mistakes, plans fall apart, men die, no one is punished, no one is held accountable. The official report was filed away. But there was one question the inquiry couldn't answer, one question that haunted everyone involved. Did those men need to die? If Whittlesey had retreated on the first day, would most of his men have survived? Probably. But he'd been ordered to hold, and retreating under fire through dense forest with wounded might have been even more deadly. If he'd surrendered on the 4th day, when the Germans offered terms, would everyone have lived? Maybe. But German POW camps weren't exactly safe either, and Whittlesey had been ordered not to surrender under any circumstances. If headquarters had sent relief on the first day instead of waiting, if the artillery hadn't shelled their own men, if the flanking units had kept pace, if Charles Whittlesey carried those questions with him for 3 years, every survivor he met, every mother who'd lost a son, every empty chair at the reunion dinners, they all asked the same silent question: why did I live when they died? Why didn't you save them? And Charles Whittlesey had no answer. So he walked into the ocean, and the questions went with him. In the years after World War I, the Lost Battalion became a legend. Newspapers embellished the story. Hollywood made movies. Songs were written. The myth grew larger than the truth. In the popular version, the Lost Battalion was a band of heroes who never wavered, never doubted, never felt fear. They stood tall against impossible odds, inspired by patriotism and courage. Their commander was a flawless leader, calm and confident, and in the end, they won. But that's not what happened. The truth is messier, darker, more human. The men of the Lost Battalion were terrified. They were cold, hungry, and hopeless. Many wanted to surrender. Some tried to escape and were shot by Germans or accidentally killed by their own officers trying to prevent desertion. They fought each other over scraps of food. They drank water contaminated with corpses. They cried. They prayed. They cursed God and their commanders and the war. They were human, and their commander, Charles Whittlesey, wasn't a superhero. He was a quiet, bookish lawyer who hated violence, who second-guessed every decision, who knew he was sending men to their deaths and didn't know if he was making the right choice. He wasn't fearless. He was terrified, but he stayed. He led. He refused to quit, not because he was a hero, but because that's what his men needed him to do. And that is the real story. Not a story about supermen who felt no fear, but a story about ordinary men who felt every ounce of fear and did what needed to be done anyway. That's the truth of the Lost Battalion, and that truth is so much more powerful than the myth ever was. Today at West Point, At officer training schools around the world, the story of the Lost Battalion is still taught. It's a case study in leadership, in decision-making under pressure, in communication failures. Military instructors ask their students, "What would you have done? If you were Whittlesey, would you have advanced? Would you have retreated? Would you have surrendered?" And the students, young men and women who've never seen combat, debate the answers. They analyze the tactics, the terrain, the communications breakdown. They argue about what Whittlesey should have done differently. But there's a lesson here that goes beyond tactics, a lesson that can't be taught from a textbook. The Lost Battalion teaches us what happens when systems fail, when the plans made by generals in comfortable headquarters meet the reality of mud and blood and chaos, when the men at the top lose track of the men at the bottom, when communication breaks down, when friendly fire kills your own soldiers, when bureaucracy and pride prevent people from admitting mistakes. These failures happen in every war. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, different forests, different enemies, different technologies. But the same fundamental problem, the fog of war, the space between intention and reality. And the Lost Battalion teaches us something else, something about human resilience, about what people can endure when they have no other choice. 5 days without food, without water, without hope, surrounded by enemies, abandoned by friends, killed by their own army. Most people would break, most people would give up. But they didn't. Why? Was it leadership? Was it training? Was it patriotism? Maybe. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe they held on because the man next to them was holding on. Because giving up would mean abandoning their friends. Because even in hell, even when everything is lost, humans refuse to quit. That's what the Lost Battalion teaches us. Not tactics, not strategy, but the strength of the human spirit when pushed to its absolute limit. Let's talk about the Pigeons for a moment, because their story is part of this too. During World War I, armies used carrier pigeons extensively. Before reliable radio communication, pigeons were often the fastest, most reliable way to send messages from the front lines. The U.S. Army Signal Corps had over 600 pigeons in service during the war. They were trained to fly back to specific lofts, no matter the distance or conditions. And they were remarkably effective. Pigeons delivered over 95% of their messages successfully, even under artillery fire, even through gas attacks, even when wounded. They saved thousands of lives, but they were expendable, just like the soldiers. When a pigeon was released into combat, there was no guarantee it would survive. German soldiers were trained to shoot any birds they saw. Machine gunners specifically targeted pigeons. Hundreds died. After the war, most of the surviving pigeons were simply released, set free. No fanfare, no ceremony. They'd served their purpose, but a few, the exceptional ones, were recognized. Cher Ami was one of 12 pigeons awarded the French Croix de Guerre for valor. There's something profound about that, about a country giving a medal to a bird. It acknowledges something we often forget. That courage isn't uniquely human. That loyalty and determination exist in other creatures too. That sometimes the smallest beings carry the largest burdens. Cher Ami couldn't understand what she was doing. She didn't know she was saving lives, didn't know she was flying into history. She just knew. Fly home. Despite the pain, despite the wounds, despite everything. Fly home. And she did. On one leg, with one eye, with shrapnel in her chest. She flew home. And in doing so, she became more than a bird. She became a symbol of determination, of sacrifice, of hope. The Lost Battalion is famous, but they weren't the only ones. During the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the same operation that produced the Lost Battalion, the American Expeditionary Force suffered over 120,000 casualties. 26,000 Americans died in those 7 weeks of fighting. 26,000 mothers received telegrams. 26,000 families hung gold stars in their windows. 26,000 young men who never came home. Most of them aren't remembered. No medals, no monuments, no documentaries. They died in unnamed shell craters, in muddy trenches, in forests no one remembers. Their bodies were never recovered. or they were buried in mass graves, unmarked. The Lost Battalion got lucky in a way. They became famous. Their story was told. But for every soldier whose name we remember, there are 100 whose names were lost. This is true of every war. We remember the heroes, the dramatic moments, the incredible stories, but we forget the ordinary deaths. The private who tripped on barbed wire and bled out alone. The sergeant who was hit by a random shell and simply ceased to exist. The lieutenant who went to check on his men and never came back, and no one ever knew what happened to him. They're all lost, all of them. Lost to history, lost to memory, lost to everyone except the families who spent lifetimes wondering what happened. In the American military cemeteries in France, there are rows upon rows of white crosses, thousands of them, and among them scattered throughout are markers that read, "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier, known but to God." Those are the truly lost, the ones whose bodies were found but never identified, whose families never got closure, who died fighting for a cause they believed in, and whose names were forgotten. When we remember the Lost Battalion, we should also remember them. The ones who stayed lost. November 1919, Washington, D.C. Major Charles Whittlesey stood at attention as President Woodrow Wilson placed the Medal of Honor around his neck, the highest military decoration in the United States, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. Whittlesey didn't want it. He'd tried to refuse it, actually, told his superiors that his men were the real heroes, that he'd just done his job. But the army insisted. America needed heroes. The war had been brutal and disillusioning. People needed to believe it meant something. So Charles Whittlesey became that symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. The ceremony was beautiful, dignified. Photographers captured the moment. Newspapers ran the story on their front pages. Medal of Honor, hero returns home in triumph. But if you look closely at the photographs from that day, if you really look at Whittlesey's face, you can see it. The emptiness in his eyes, the weight he's carrying. This is the cost of glory, the price of heroism. It's not just the battle. It's not just the trauma. It's what comes after. When you become a hero, you're no longer a person. You're a symbol, an inspiration, a story. People project onto you. They expect you to embody their ideals. They want you to be brave and strong and proud. They don't want to hear about the nightmares, the guilt, the doubt. They don't want to know that you wake up every night hearing the screams of men you couldn't save. They don't want to see you human. Charles Whittlesey tried. He tried to be the hero they wanted. He gave speeches, attended ceremonies, shook thousands of hands. He smiled for the cameras, but inside he was drowning. And eventually, he couldn't do it anymore. So he walked out onto that ship deck, looked at the dark water, and he let himself go. Was that weakness? Or was it just human? What do we learn from all this? What does the Lost Battalion teach us more than a century later? First, that heroism is complicated. It's not always glorious. It's not always rewarding. Sometimes the people we call heroes are just people who refused to quit when quitting made more sense. Sometimes they pay for that decision for the rest of their lives. Second, that leadership is burden. Whittlesey made the best decisions he could with the information he had. He kept his men alive as long as possible. He refused to surrender when surrender might have meant death anyway. But he also watched over 300 men die under his command, and that weight never leaves you. Third, that wars are fought by human beings, not heroes, not villains, not pawns on a chessboard. Human beings with families, with fears, with limits. And when we send them to war, we break them, even the ones who survive, especially the ones who survive. Fourth, that small acts matter. A pigeon wounded and half-blind flying through hell, a soldier sharing his last piece of food, an officer refusing to abandon his men even when it costs him everything. These moments, these small, quiet moments of courage and compassion are what save us. Not the grand strategies, not the speeches, not the medals, the small acts. And finally, that we remember. Not because the past is glorious, but because the past is real. Real people, real suffering, real sacrifice. And if we forget, if we let these stories disappear, then their deaths meant nothing. So we remember the Lost Battalion. We remember Charles Whittlesey, who led them into hell and couldn't forgive himself for bringing them back. We remember Cher Ami, who flew when she should have fallen. We remember the 554 men who walked into the Argonne Forest and the 194 who walked out. We remember their names, their faces, their stories, because they were there, in that ravine, in that darkness, and they held. If you visit the Argonne Forest today in the spring, it's beautiful. Sunlight filters through the canopy, birds sing, wildflowers bloom in the clearings where shells once exploded. It's hard to imagine that this place was once hell on earth, but the forest remembers, in the layers of soil, in the roots of ancient trees, in the rust and bones still buried beneath the moss. The forest remembers. There's a path now, a trail that winds through the area where the Lost Battalion fought. Hikers walk it. Families picnic nearby. Life goes on, as it should. But sometimes, on quiet mornings, when the mist hangs low between the trees, if you stand very still, you can almost hear them, the voices of young men calling to each other in the darkness. Hold on. Help is coming. Don't give up. 5 days in October 1918. 554 men trapped in a ravine, cut off, forgotten, left to die. But they didn't die, not all of them. Because a commander refused to surrender, because soldiers refused to abandon each other, because a small bird with one eye and one leg flew through hell and carried hope home on broken wings. This was the story of the Lost Battalion, the Americans who were left to die in the forest, but who refused to stay lost. Subscribe to the channel for upcoming World War I stories